Recently, I did some latency tests on different keyboards to see how wireless ZMK compared to other types of keyboards like QMK, wired ZMK, and a gaming keyboard. And I want to share the results that I found with you. Of course, the first thing I actually want to do is show you how I measured it. So here we can see that we have a little breadboard, and what it does is it connects two of the pins which are connected to what would normally be a switch on a nice Nano, which is running ZMK. And then we have this button here which acts as the switch, but before it gets to the other side, we also run it through an LED, so when I press the button, the LED lights up. And what that lets us do is we can see once we press this button, the red LED will turn on within a millisecond, and we can count how many frames it takes for that key press to show up on the monitor. I used a Sony RX100V, which is able to record at 1000 frames per second, so every frame is about a millisecond when we count through it. So for these tests, I'm running Windows 10 and I'm using a 120 Hz 10-bit panel. And what I'll be doing is I'll be pressing the button and it will be typing into Notepad on Windows, and we'll be measuring how long it takes for that key to show up inside of Notepad. And I'll show an example right here. And we can see that when I press the button, the red LED turns on, and then we count the frames. And then we can see when the one shows up, and as soon as it shows up, we can see how long it takes in the real world for that press to happen and actually show up on your computer. This testing was done on a nice Nano for ZMK, a Pro Micro for QMK, and then I have a Corsair keyboard as kind of the mainstream gaming keyboard to compare. So without any further ado, let's look right at the results. So looking at this first box plot, I'll first explain all the different setups we have here. So first we have fast ZMK USB. And what this is showing is basically the normal ZMK build over USB, except we're actually running it at 1000 Hertz polling rate instead of the default of 125. And this was changed by using this kconfig option, which you can put into your .config file if you're familiar with ZMK at all. And we can see that it's right around the 48.5 is its median for the response time. So that's from the LED lighting up to the text actually showing inside of Notepad. Next we have default ZMK USB, which is just stock ZMK running with the 125 Hz polling rate, just a little bit slower polling rate than USB. Then we have default QMK, which is also running at 125 Hz polling rate, and that was pulled just straight from the configurator, which gives us these results, which are really quite similar, and that's kind of what you would expect from 125 Hz. Then we can see the Corsair Vengeance K65. So this is an older Corsair keyboard, but it's still a gaming keyboard nonetheless. And I did confirm it was running at 1000 Hz, but for some reason it performs quite poorly, even though it's running at 1000 Hz. It performs more similarly to the 125 Hz polling rate items. Then we have what I call fast ZMK BLE, which is this is the wireless ZMK. And what I did is I forced it to have the BLE interval be 7.5 milliseconds. ZMK by default allows a 7.5 millisecond to 15 millisecond range, and I forced it to only use 7.5 milliseconds. And then finally we can see default ZMK BLE, which is 15 milliseconds, and that's just straight stock wireless ZMK. And it kind of just defaults to 15 milliseconds because the computer would rather do 15 than 7.5 when it negotiates. So running down the line in terms of speed, we have our fast ZMK USB at 47.5 milliseconds median, which is pretty okay. I mean, it's not blazing fast, but also you have to consider all the processing time on the computer side. Then we have the default ZMK USB at 3.5 milliseconds slower on the median. And then we can see default QMK and Corsair Vengeance K65 that run at that exact same median. And here I'll be referencing the median because it's probably the most accurate as what you'll be feeling or experiencing. Next we get fast ZMK BLE, which is just a couple milliseconds slower than the USB defaults, or than ZMK USB or default QMK, and which I found was quite impressive. We can also see that the variance or the range of the values that I got from fast ZMK BLE was really small. And this is most likely just due to the small sample rate I had. Again, these numbers aren't going to be the most accurate thing in the world, but they're a pretty good indicator of what you'll be experiencing in certain conditions. And then finally, we have our default ZMK BLE with the larger range and the slower more around 58 milliseconds, which is just about 4 milliseconds slower than the fast ZMK BLE. So overall, you can kind of see that, of course, the wireless is a bit slower. However, if we take a look at the same Boxplots but with the zero origin setup, it helps us see how little of a difference there actually really is when you have this wireless setup. So you can see that the fast ZMK BLE is really not all that off of these USB ones. Of course, the default ZMK BLE is a little bit slower, but it's going to be really hard for you to perceive this unless you're looking for something extremely low latency, which in that case, you're probably going to have to even test things outside of the Corsair Vengeance K65, since it didn't even perform super well against the fast ZMK USB. So despite the wireless performing quite well on my computer setup, you also have to consider that I have a very solid wireless BLE experience. I have the actual wireless chip built into the motherboard, and I'm using Windows, which plays pretty nicely with this. In other setups, you may have worse performance. The USB dongles for this wireless BLE are not always the best, and you're not always going to get the best performance either from a PCIe device. So in general, for these wireless BLE things, it's going to be more hit or miss, but if you get a solid experience, it's going to be quite similar to a wired experience. Another thing to note is the fact that QMK has something called eager debounce. So debouncing is something that's used to make sure that you don't get key chatter or your key pressing multiple times when you press down because electronics aren't perfect. And you can use something called eager debouncing in QMK, which eliminates that initial 5 milliseconds of standard delay, which you can also see in ZMK. So you can actually drop down this default QMK down about 5 milliseconds from where it is, so it'll actually end up being the fastest. But this is also something that's being planned to be implemented into ZMK in the future. So then, of course, fast ZMK USB will leapfrog that as well. So they're going to be able to be a little bit faster than even what you see here. And that same debouncing also will affect the wireless ones. They'll also be able to be improved by 5 milliseconds, which coincidentally would make fast ZMK BLE perform better than the Corsair Vengeance K65 if it uses eager debouncing. Another thing I'd like to mention is the fact that I used Notepad on Windows to test the latency of these keyboards. And while I think it's a pretty good test to see how your keyboard will perform on the desktop, if you're doing any sort of gaming, you're probably going to get even lower latencies in something like a competitive shooter like CSGO or Valorant, which can have much lower latencies. I did some initial testing and I could see that you can get CSGO and Valorant latency down to about, from what I could see, about 20 milliseconds. So at those levels, these 2, 3, 4, 5 millisecond differences might be a bigger deal to you than it is on the desktop with Notepad. In that case, eager debouncing would be very beneficial for you. Overall, though, I just want to make a quick video to show how these compare and to show that the wireless BLE performance really isn't all that awful. Of course, it's not perfect, and another thing to note about BLE is the fact that you get some really long delays every once in a while. Of course, this depends on your hardware. If you have really solid hardware, you'll almost never experience it, but if you have poor hardware, you'll get them quite often. But for the most part, at least for me, on my setup, I've had a very solid experience, and I even play games on it, and I don't really experience any lag. But of course, I'm not a super competitive gamer, so maybe that'll be different for you. But I hope you enjoyed seeing how these different latencies compared between the different keyboards, and hopefully I can do some more tests and we can continue to improve the ZMK firmware from these findings. So thanks.